The AH-64 Apache helicopter sat in Hangar 7 at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, a machine worth $56 million that had been rendered completely useless. It had been there for 6 weeks, and in those 6 weeks, the Army's best engineers and specialists had tried everything. Nothing worked. The problem was in the rotors. Specifically, in the main rotor control system that managed the blade pitch angles. The Apache's predecessor had flown for decades without this particular issue. But this newer model, with all its upgrades and improvements, had developed a fault that nobody could identify, let alone fix. The symptoms were clear: the rotor system would vibrate unpredictably once the helicopter reached 70% power. The vibration was severe enough to damage other systems and make the aircraft completely unairworthy. The moment a pilot pushed the power beyond 70%, the bird shook itself apart. The Army had called in Boeing engineers. They had called in Sikorsky specialists. They had called in experts from Lockheed Martin. They had spent over $200,000 on diagnostic equipment. They had taken apart and examined every single component of that rotor system, and they had found nothing wrong. The official conclusion, delivered by the lead Boeing engineer, a man named Dr. Richard Helmuth, was that the problem was not with the helicopter itself but with the way it was being maintained, operated, or assembled. The Army had done something wrong, in other words. The machine was fine. The only problem was that the machine wasn't fine. It wouldn't fly. And there were Apache helicopters in theater in 3 different combat zones that were experiencing the same problem. If they couldn't figure out what was wrong with this one, they couldn't figure out what was wrong with the others. Colonel James Morrison stood in the hangar, looking at the disabled aircraft, and felt the weight of the problem settling on his shoulders. Morrison was the commanding officer of the 101st Combat Aviation Brigade. He had 30 years of military experience and a reputation for solving impossible problems. But this problem seemed unsolvable. "We're going to have to ground the entire fleet," his maintenance officer, Major Lisa Chen, said quietly beside him. "If we can't figure out what's wrong with one, we can't trust any of them. We have to ground them all until we know what we're dealing with." Morrison knew she was right. But grounding the entire Apache fleet would have implications that reached all the way up to the Pentagon. It would affect operations in 3 combat zones. It would create a political disaster. It would make the Army look like it couldn't manage its own equipment. "We're not grounding anything yet," Morrison said. "We're missing something. There's something that all these experts aren't seeing. We need to think differently." That night, Morrison couldn't sleep. He lay in his quarters, thinking about the problem. He thought about the rotor system and the vibration and the fact that nothing was mechanically wrong but the helicopter still wouldn't work. He got up and went to his computer. He started looking through the personnel records of people who had worked with Special Operations aviation units. If anyone would know how to think differently about a complex mechanical problem, it would be someone who had worked with Special Operations. Special Ops people didn't have the luxury of following conventional wisdom. They had to improvise, adapt, and find solutions that other people couldn't see. Morrison searched the database and found what he was looking for. A name: Major Chris Garrett. Retired 5 years ago after 22 years of active military service. 12 of those years had been spent as an engineer with the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. The most elite helicopter unit in the entire military. Morrison made a phone call to the retirement office and got Chris Garrett's contact information. It was 11 at night, but Morrison didn't care. This was important. The phone rang 4 times before someone answered. A man's voice, rough with sleep. "Hello," Chris said. "Major Garrett, this is Colonel James Morrison. I'm sorry to call so late. I know you're retired. But I have a problem, and I think you might be the only person who can help me." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What kind of problem?" Chris asked, sounding more awake. "We have an AH-64 Apache with a rotor vibration issue," Morrison said. "We've had Boeing, Sikorsky, Lockheed Martin, all looking at it. Nobody can find anything wrong. But the helicopter won't fly. I need someone who can think outside the box. I need someone from Special Ops. Another pause. Then Chris said, I don't work on helicopters anymore, Colonel. I left the Army 5 years ago. I'm not interested in coming back. I'm not asking you to come back, Morrison said. I'm asking you to take a look at one helicopter. Give me a few hours of your time. That's all I'm asking. Chris was quiet for a long time. Morrison could almost hear him thinking, weighing the request against whatever it was that had made him leave the military in the first place. Send me the data, Chris finally said. The maintenance logs, the diagnostic reports, everything. I'll take a look. But I'm not promising anything. Chris hung up before Morrison could respond. The next morning, Morrison had his team send over all the diagnostic data to Chris's email address. He included the reports from Boeing, the findings from Sikorsky, the maintenance records, the flight test data, everything. For 3 days, Morrison heard nothing. He started to think that Chris wasn't going to call back, that he had looked at the problem and decided it was unsolvable, just like everyone else. Then, on the afternoon of the 4th day, Chris called. I'm coming to Fort Campbell, Chris said without preamble. I'll be there tomorrow morning. I'll need access to the helicopter and to your maintenance logs. Yes, Morrison said, relief flooding through him. Thank you. Thank you so much. Don't thank me yet, Chris said. I might not be able to fix this. But I have an idea about what might be wrong. And I need to see the bird in person to confirm it. The next morning, Chris Garrett walked into Hangar 7. He was a tall man, lean and muscular despite being in his mid-50s. His hair was gray at the temples, and his eyes had the kind of intensity that came from spending years in high-stress situations. He wore jeans and a gray t-shirt. No fanfare. No announcement. He just walked in and started looking at the Apache. For the first 2 hours, he didn't say anything to anybody. He just walked around the helicopter, examining it from different angles. He climbed up on the airframe and looked at the rotor head from above. He got down and looked at the main rotor control system from below. He walked the entire circumference of the aircraft multiple times. Dr. Richard Helmuth, the Boeing engineer, was standing in the hangar, and he watched Chris with obvious skepticism. Can I help you? Helmuth asked coldly. Chris didn't respond. He continued his examination. Finally, after almost 3 hours, Chris climbed down from the aircraft and asked to see the maintenance logs again. Major Lisa Chen brought them over, and Chris sat down and started reading through them carefully. He made notes on a piece of paper. He read parts of the logs multiple times. He cross-referenced different sections. I need to see the original assembly procedures for this aircraft, Chris said finally. The Boeing documentation or the Army procedures? Lisa asked. Both, Chris said. They brought him the documentation, and Chris spent another 2 hours reading through it. By this point, it was getting late in the afternoon. Dr. Helmuth had left. Most of the hangar staff had left. It was just Chris and Colonel Morrison and Major Chen, standing in the hangar as the sun started to set outside the doors. Finally, Chris stood up. I know what the problem is, he said quietly. Morrison and Chen both went very still. What is it? Morrison asked. It's not a mechanical failure, Chris said. The problem is in the rotor head assembly. Specifically, in the swashplate bearing system. But it's not failing because the part itself is defective. It's failing because someone, probably at the factory during final assembly, installed the bearing race backwards. Morrison felt his stomach drop. Backwards? The bearing race has a specific orientation, Chris explained. The internal geometry is not symmetrical. If you install it backwards, it will function at lower power levels. But once you get to higher power levels, the forces being generated will exceed what the bearing was designed to handle in that orientation. That's when you get the vibration. But the inspection, Chen said. The quality control at Boeing should have caught that. You'd think so, Chris said. But if nobody's looking for something specifically, they don't see it. The bearing looks fine to the naked eye. It functions fine at low power. You have to understand how the bearing race is oriented to understand that it's backwards. You have to know to look for it. How do we fix it? Morrison asked. We take apart the rotor head, Chris said. We remove the swash plate bearing system. We flip the bearing race so it's oriented correctly. And then we reassemble everything. He paused. It's a 2-hour job, he continued. Maybe 3 if we're being careful. Morrison looked at Chris in disbelief. 6 weeks. $200,000. Boeing, Sikorsky, Lockheed Martin. And the answer was, flip one part around. Why didn't anyone else see this? Morrison asked. Chris shrugged. Because they approached it like mechanics. They looked for something broken. But nothing was broken. It was just wrong. And that's a different kind of problem. You have to think differently to solve a different kind of problem. Within 24 hours, Chris and the Army maintenance team had disassembled the rotor head and confirmed his diagnosis. The bearing race was indeed installed backwards. The internal geometry was oriented incorrectly. The team spent 2 hours reassembling it properly. Then came the test flight. Chris didn't go on the test flight. He stood in the hangar and waited while the Apache took off. Colonel Morrison was in the operations center, monitoring the flight data. Major Chen stood beside Chris. How are you so sure this is the problem? Chen asked him. I've spent 12 years working on helicopters with special operations, Chris said. When you're running black ops, when you're flying in hostile territory, you don't have the luxury of waiting for parts to be shipped or for engineers to debug issues. You have to understand the systems at a deep level. You have to be able to see a problem that might not be obvious. You have to think about not just what's broken, but what might be wrong. Is there a difference? Chen asked. Huge difference, Chris said. Broken means something is damaged and needs to be replaced. Wrong means something is functioning but not as intended. Most engineers are trained to find broken things. Special ops people are trained to find wrong things. Because in the field, a wrong helicopter can kill you just as dead as a broken one. About 40 minutes later, the Apache came back in to land. Chris watched it descend, and he could already tell that something was different. The helicopter's movements were smoother. The landing was precise and controlled. The pilot, a captain named David Torres, climbed out of the Apache with a huge grin on his face. Whatever you did, Torres said to Chris, thank you. That bird is flying like a dream. The vibration is completely gone. I took her up to 95% power. Smooth as butter. Colonel Morrison came walking into the hangar, and he grabbed Chris's hand and shook it firmly. You fixed it, Morrison said. One part, backwards. That was the whole problem. That was the problem with this aircraft, Chris said. But I'm betting it's the problem with the others too. Morrison's expression changed. You mean? I mean, Chris interrupted, that if the first aircraft came off the assembly line with the bearing race installed backwards, I'd be willing to bet that all the other new-build Apaches probably have the same problem. Because it's a systematic manufacturing error, not an isolated incident. Morrison immediately got on the phone to the Pentagon. He explained the problem and the solution. Within hours, Boeing had launched an investigation into their assembly procedures for the bearing race system. The investigation found exactly what Chris had predicted. A change in the assembly procedure 6 months earlier had created a situation where the bearing race could be easily installed backwards. Out of the 47 new Apache helicopters that had been assembled in the last 6 months, 39 of them had the bearing race installed backwards. The Army faced a choice: ground all the aircraft and reassemble them one at a time, a process that would take months and cost millions of dollars, or find a way to do a field fix on all the aircraft simultaneously. Chris suggested a third option. Bring the aircraft back in waves, he said. 1 or 2 per week. With a team that knows what it's doing, we can fix each one in a single day. No downtime in the field. Just rotate them back, fix them, and send them back out. Morrison pitched the plan to the Pentagon, and it was approved. Over the next 4 months, Chris worked with the Army maintenance crews to fix all 39 affected helicopters. He trained the maintenance teams on how to identify the problem and how to fix it. He created detailed documentation and videos showing exactly what needed to be done. And with each helicopter they fixed, the maintenance crews got faster and more efficient. By the end of the 4 months, a crew could fix the rotor head bearing system in just over an hour. The Army saved an estimated $15 million by taking Chris's approach instead of grounding the entire fleet. But more importantly, they had learned a lesson: sometimes you need fresh eyes. Sometimes you need someone who hasn't been trained in conventional thinking. Sometimes you need someone who understands that there's a difference between something being broken and something being wrong. Chris finished the final helicopter fix on a Thursday afternoon. When he walked out of the hangar, Colonel Morrison was waiting for him. "Come back," Morrison said. "Full time. Come back and work with us. We need people who think the way you think." Chris was quiet for a long moment. "I left the military because I needed a break," Chris said. "I was burned out. I'd been running too hard for too long. I needed to step away and remember why I ever joined in the first place." "And?" Morrison asked. "And I think I remember," Chris said. "I remember because I just spent 4 months solving problems with helicopters. And I remembered how much I love that work. How much it matters." Morrison smiled. "Does that mean you'll come back?" he asked. "It means," Chris said, "that I'll think about it. But I'm not coming back as active duty. I'm done with that. But maybe there's something else we can work out." Chris didn't go back to active military service. But he did agree to a consulting arrangement with the Army. He would work 3 days a week with Fort Campbell's aviation units, helping them train maintenance crews and troubleshoot problems. The rest of his time would be his own. It was the perfect arrangement for someone who had been burned out and needed to find balance. But something unexpected happened. Word about Chris and what he had done with the Apache spread through the Army's aviation community. Soon he was being called in to help with other problems. A Black Hawk helicopter with an electrical issue. A Chinook with a transmission problem. An Apache with a fuel system malfunction. And in every case, Chris would come in, look at the problem with fresh eyes, and find something that the conventional approach had missed. It wasn't magic. It wasn't superhuman intuition. It was a different way of thinking. It was asking different questions. It was not assuming that someone else's diagnosis was correct just because they had impressive credentials. After about 6 months of this, a general named Michael Harrison came to Fort Campbell to see what was happening. Harrison was the head of Army Aviation Command, and he had heard rumors about a retired engineer who was fixing helicopter problems that nobody else could solve. Colonel Morrison showed Harrison the data. The helicopters that had been fixed. The problems that had been solved. The money that had been saved. "Who is this Chris Garrett?" Harrison asked. "A former special operations engineer," Morrison said. 12 years with the 160th. He had a gift for seeing things others missed. We called him in to help with that bearing race issue, and it turns out that gift is something we can use across the entire fleet." Harrison asked to meet Chris. They met in Morrison's office. Harrison was a tall man, with the posture of someone who had commanded thousands of people, and the bearing of someone who didn't waste time on small talk. "Major Garrett," Harrison said, "I've looked at your work. You're fixing problems that engineers from Boeing and Lockheed Martin couldn't solve." "How?" "I think differently," Chris said simply. I ask different questions. Can you teach people to do that? Harrison asked. Chris paused. It was a good question. Could you teach people to think differently? Yes, he said finally. But it requires changing how we approach problem solving. It requires being willing to question assumptions. It requires not being satisfied with, that's how we've always done it. Harrison leaned back in his chair. I want you to design a program, he said. A training program for our maintenance teams. I want you to teach them how to think the way you think. How to approach problems differently. And I want to implement it across all Army aviation units. That's a big ask, Chris said. I know, Harrison said. But I've seen what you can do. And I think the Army needs it. I think we've been solving problems the same way for too long. I think we need people who ask different questions. Over the next year, Chris designed what became known as the Adaptive Problem-Solving Program for Army Maintenance. It was unlike anything the Army had done before. Instead of teaching people the correct procedures, it taught them how to think critically about problems. It taught them to question assumptions. It taught them to look for things that didn't fit the expected pattern. And it worked. Maintenance teams that went through the program started finding problems that had been hidden in plain sight. A fuel pump issue that had been wrongly diagnosed as a filter problem. A hydraulic issue that was actually a sensor calibration issue. An electrical problem that was created by a design flaw in the wiring harness. Each discovery led to fixes. Each fix led to improved safety and reliability. And more importantly, it changed the culture of Army aviation maintenance. It transformed maintenance crews from people who simply followed procedures to people who understood the systems they were working with. People who could think critically and solve problems instead of just replacing parts. Within 2 years, accident rates in Army aviation had dropped by 18%. Maintenance costs had dropped by 12%. Aircraft availability had increased by 22%. All because one retired engineer had walked into a hangar and asked different questions. General Harrison asked Chris to give a presentation to the Army's leadership at the Pentagon. Chris didn't want to. He wasn't comfortable with public speaking or being in the spotlight. But Harrison was persuasive. You've changed how the Army maintains its aircraft, Harrison said. You've made them safer and more reliable. The Pentagon needs to know that this is possible. They need to hear it from you. So Chris went to the Pentagon, dressed in a suit that felt uncomfortable on someone who preferred to work with his hands, and stood in front of a room full of generals and colonels and military leadership. He didn't give a slick presentation. He didn't use fancy graphics or complicated data visualization. He just talked about the Apache helicopter. He talked about how everyone assumed the problem was one thing, and how one person asking different questions had found it was something else entirely. The military spends billions of dollars on equipment and training, Chris said. But sometimes, we don't spend enough time teaching people how to think. We teach them procedures. We teach them checklists. We teach them how to follow orders. But we don't teach them how to ask questions. We don't teach them how to challenge assumptions. We don't teach them how to solve problems that don't fit the template. He paused, looking at the faces of the people in the room. And that's a missed opportunity, he continued. Because somewhere in this room, there's someone who has a gift for seeing things others miss. Someone who can solve problems that everyone else thinks are unsolvable. But they're never going to develop that gift if we don't create an environment that rewards questioning and critical thinking. The room was silent when Chris finished. Then someone started applauding, and soon the entire room was applauding. It was the beginning of a much larger transformation in military thinking. The success of the Adaptive Problem-Solving Program at Fort Campbell caught the attention of other military branches. The Navy wanted to implement it with helicopter maintenance crews. The Air Force wanted to use it with aircraft maintenance teams. Even the Marines wanted to train their helicopter units. Chris suddenly found himself in demand in a way he had never anticipated. But instead of trying to manage it all himself, Chris did something smart. He brought in other people. Former special operations personnel. Engineers who had spent years thinking about problems in unconventional ways. People who understood that sometimes the best solution comes from not following the conventional playbook. He created an organization called Adaptive Solutions Military Consulting. The organization was dedicated to bringing special operations thinking into conventional military maintenance and problem solving. Chris brought in Major Diana Chen, the maintenance officer from Fort Campbell, as his co-founder. He brought in another retired special operations engineer named Captain Marcus Williams. He brought in a former Air Force combat controller named Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Price, who had spent years solving complex logistical problems in the field. Together, they created a team that could train military personnel across all branches in adaptive problem solving. Within 3 years, the program had been implemented in over 200 military installations. Tens of thousands of maintenance personnel had gone through the training. And the results were remarkable. Aircraft availability rates increased across the board. Maintenance costs decreased. Most importantly, accident rates dropped. Equipment that had been considered chronically unreliable suddenly became reliable. Problems that had plagued military aviation for years were solved. The program expanded beyond aircraft maintenance. It started being used by logistics teams, by operations personnel, by anyone whose job involved solving complex problems. And it all started with one Apache helicopter that wouldn't fly, and one engineer who asked different questions. One day, General Harrison called Chris into his office. "I've been authorized to offer you something," Harrison said. "The Pentagon wants to hire you as a civilian advisor to the Chief of Staff. Your title would be Director of Adaptive Problem Solving for the Department of Defense. You would be responsible for implementing this program across all military branches. You would have access to resources, personnel, funding. You could do this on a much larger scale than you've been doing." Chris listened without responding. "It's a significant opportunity," Harrison continued. "You could change how the entire military approaches problems. You could save lives and save billions of dollars. Isn't that worth considering?" Chris thought about his first conversation with General Harrison. He thought about why he had left the military in the first place. Burnout. Exhaustion. The sense of running too hard for too long. "I need to think about it," Chris said. "Let me talk to Diana and the team." That evening, Chris met with the co-founders of Adaptive Solutions. He told them about Harrison's offer. "Take it," Diana said immediately. "This is what we've been building toward. This is the opportunity to change military culture on a scale we couldn't do as a private consulting firm." "But it means going back," Chris said. "It means being pulled into military bureaucracy. It means giving up the balance I've tried to create." "Maybe the balance changes," Marcus said. "Maybe the balance is different when you're doing work that matters this much. Maybe the balance isn't 50-50 anymore. Maybe it's 60-40, 70-30, because the work is important enough to warrant that." Sarah Price was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that made Chris stop and really listen. "I left the military burned out," Sarah said. "I thought I was done. I thought I couldn't do this work anymore. But then I found this team, and I found that what burned me out wasn't the work. It was the culture. It was being told that things had to be done a certain way. It was being punished for thinking differently. But here, we're rewarded for thinking differently. Here, our way of approaching problems is valued instead of discouraged. And that changes everything." She looked at Chris directly. "So the question isn't whether you go back to the military," Sarah continued. "The question is whether you go back to the military that burned you out, or whether you go back with the power to change that military into something different." Chris thought about that for a long time. The next morning, he called General Harrison and said yes. 5 years after Chris Garrett had walked into Hangar 7 at Fort Campbell, he sat in an office in the Pentagon. The office wasn't impressive, at least not in terms of size. It was small and functional, with windows that looked out onto the courtyard. But it was his office, as the Director of Adaptive Problem Solving for the Department of Defense. On his wall were photographs of helicopters and aircraft that had been repaired using adaptive problem-solving techniques. There were letters from maintenance personnel whose careers had been transformed by the program. There was a commendation from the Secretary of Defense. But the thing that meant the most to Chris was a simple framed photograph on his desk. It was of the Apache helicopter from Fort Campbell, the one that wouldn't fly, the one that all the experts had said was fine. In the photograph, the helicopter was in the air, silhouetted against a blue sky, flying strong. Chris had trained over 50,000 military personnel in adaptive problem solving. The program had expanded from aircraft maintenance to every aspect of military operations. There were divisions in logistics, in supply chain management, in communications, in strategic planning. All using the principles that Chris had pioneered: ask different questions, challenge assumptions, don't accept conventional wisdom as truth. The results had been remarkable. Military efficiency had increased. Costs had decreased. Lives had been saved. But Chris wasn't satisfied. He was sitting in a meeting with the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Walter Mitchell, when Mitchell asked him what he wanted to do next. "I want to expand this beyond the military," Chris said. "I think these principles apply everywhere. In manufacturing. In construction. In healthcare. In education. I want to create a foundation that teaches adaptive problem solving to anyone who wants to learn it." Mitchell leaned back in his chair. "You're talking about leaving," Mitchell said. It wasn't a question. "I'm talking about transitioning," Chris said. "I'll still work with the military. I'll still be available for consulting. But I think my real legacy is going to be bigger than just the military." Mitchell was quiet for a long moment. "You've earned the right to do whatever you want," Mitchell said finally. "You've changed how we operate. You've made us better. If you want to go create something bigger, I'm not going to stand in your way." So Chris left the Pentagon. Diana Chen came with him. Together, with Marcus Williams and Sarah Price and several other co-founders, they established the Adaptive Foundation. The foundation provided training in adaptive problem solving to anyone who wanted it. They worked with manufacturing companies, with hospitals, with schools, with nonprofits. And they continued to train military personnel, but now they were also training civilians. 10 years after Chris had walked into Hangar 7, he was invited to give a keynote address at a large conference on innovation and problem solving. The conference was attended by thousands of people from a wide variety of industries. Chris stood on stage and told the story of the Apache helicopter. He told them about the bearing race that was installed backwards. He told them about the 6 weeks and the $200,000 and the experts who couldn't find the answer. "And you know what the answer was?" Chris asked. It was asking a different question. It was approaching the problem from a different angle. It was being willing to challenge the assumption that if the part didn't look broken, maybe it wasn't the problem. He paused, letting that sink in. "In my years in the military, I learned something," Chris continued. "I learned that sometimes, the people with the most impressive credentials are the least likely to find solutions to new problems. Because they're approaching the problem the way they've always approached problems. And that works great until it doesn't. Until you encounter a problem that doesn't fit the template. Until you encounter something that looks fine but is fundamentally wrong." He looked out at the audience. "So my question to you is this: in your organizations, in your companies, in your industries, are you encouraging people to ask different questions? Are you creating space for people to challenge assumptions? Or are you rewarding people for following procedures and doing things the way they've always been done?" The room was completely silent. "Because if you're the latter," Chris continued, "then somewhere in your organization, there's a solution to a problem you haven't solved yet. And that solution is hidden because you're not asking the right questions. You're not creating space for people to think differently." The applause that followed lasted for 3 minutes. After the speech, dozens of people came up to Chris wanting to implement the Adaptive Foundations program in their organizations. Hospitals wanted to use it for diagnostic protocols. Manufacturing companies wanted to use it for quality control. Schools wanted to use it in their engineering programs. Chris realized something in that moment. The Apache helicopter had been about saving military aviation. But the real story was bigger than that. The real story was about changing how people think. About creating cultures where asking different questions was valued instead of punished. About making space for people who saw things differently. Years later, when Chris was in his 70s, a young engineer came to see him. The engineer had gone through the Adaptive Foundations program. She had been working in an automotive manufacturing company, and she had used adaptive thinking to discover a design flaw in a brake system that was affecting thousands of vehicles. The company had made the fix, and lives had been saved. "I wanted to thank you," the engineer said. "If it wasn't for your program, I would never have been confident enough to question the design. I would have just done my job and moved on. But because of what you taught me, I felt empowered to ask different questions. And that made all the difference." Chris remembered what had made him leave the military in the first place. Burnout. The sense of being trapped in a system that valued following procedures over thinking critically. The exhaustion that came from running too hard, too long, without feeling like his unique way of thinking was valued. And he realized that he had found a way to change that system. Not by working within it, but by creating something that transcended it. Something that went beyond the military and touched every industry, every institution, every place where people solved problems. The Apache helicopter that wouldn't fly had been about more than just fixing a helicopter. It had been about awakening something that had been dormant. It had been about proving that one person, thinking differently, could solve problems that seemed unsolvable. And that once you proved that was possible, you could teach it to others. And once others learned it, they could teach it to others still. The ripple effects never stopped. Chris went back to Fort Campbell one more time, about 15 years after he had first fixed that Apache helicopter. Colonel Morrison was retired now, but he met Chris at the hangar where it had all begun. The old Apache was still there, still flying, still in service. It had been through another 7 years of operation since Chris had fixed it, and it was running better than ever. Morrison and Chris stood looking at the helicopter, and Morrison said something that Chris had never forgotten. "Do you know what changed that day when you walked in?" Morrison asked. "We found the problem," Chris said. "The bearing race was backwards." "No," Morrison said. "We learned how to see. We learned that there was a way to see problems that everyone else had missed. And once we knew it was possible, we couldn't unknow it. We couldn't go back to being blind. And that changed everything." Chris smiled. He thought about that Apache helicopter, sitting in Hangar 7 all those years ago. He thought about the experts who had looked at it and seen nothing wrong. He thought about his phone call with Colonel Morrison. He thought about the decision to walk into that hangar without any grand plan, just willing to see what others had missed. And he thought about all the helicopters that had been fixed since then. All the problems that had been solved. All the people who had been trained in adaptive thinking. All the organizations that had been changed by approaching problems differently. It all started because one engineer had been willing to ask a different question. It all started because one helicopter wouldn't fly, and nobody would accept the answer that nothing was wrong. It all started because someone had the courage to look at what everyone else had looked at and see something different. That was the real legacy of that Apache helicopter. Not the bearing race. Not the $17 million saved. Not even the Adaptive Foundation or the thousands of problems solved. The real legacy was the proof that change was possible. That one person, thinking differently, could transform systems. That asking different questions could reveal answers nobody else could see. That the way things had always been done wasn't the only way they could be done. Chris Garrett had never wanted to be famous. He had never wanted to be the center of attention. He had just wanted to go back and look at a helicopter and understand why it wasn't working. But in doing that, in being willing to ask different questions, he had changed the world. And somewhere, some young person who had been told that the way they thought was wrong, that they saw things too differently, that they didn't fit the mold, that young person had found the adaptive foundation. That young person had learned that the way they thought was actually a gift. And that young person was now using that gift to solve problems that nobody else could solve. The ripples continued to spread. And they would keep spreading, long after Chris was gone, because he had proven, one Apache helicopter at a time, that seeing differently could change everything. Is in knowing that there are different questions to ask.